Earlier this year, we released the F.E.A.R retrospective, a deep dive into the creation of one of the most celebrated first-person shooters of all time. What helped put F.E.A.R on the map in the eyes of many players as well as game developers was the underlying AI technology that powered the enemy combatants throughout the experience. This AI planning technique took inspiration from a corner of artificial intelligence research that until that time had very little impact on the video games industry. And in our original video, we learned about how it all came together, courtesy of none other than Jeff Orkin, the AI programmer on F.E.A.R. But while F.E.A.R continues to be held in high regard even today, it was Orkin's last contribution to the franchise, having been credited on several titles at Monolith and being heavily involved in the AI of both No One Lives Forever 2 and later F.E.A.R. Jeff left the games industry in the summer of 2005, only to return more recently with his new startup called Bitpart, where they're taking a new approach to building interesting and dynamic non-player characters. But critically, I wanted to figure out what happened in between. After all, Jeff left Monolith mere weeks before F.E.A.R's release to pursue a career in grad school. I'm Tommy Thompson, and for this episode of AI in Games, we're going to answer a question that has sat in the back of my mind for close to 20 years. What happened to Jeff Orkin? Now look, let's not bury the lead. Jeff's fine. This isn't one of those really messed up Netflix documentaries where you find out he's been in a cult for the last 8 years. In fact, I can attest to this, that he's fine, not that he was in a cult, because I met Jeff in person for the first time at the Game Developers Conference earlier this year, and this was after I had ran several hours of interviews with him for our F.E.A.R retrospective. So I can say quite confidently, he's doing well, he's having fun, and he's working hard on all the cool stuff happening over at Bitpart, which we'll get to in a minute. But when I reached out to Jeff about interviewing him for the retrospective, I explained that I wanted to know more than just his experiences working on the game. I wanted to find out where his career had taken him, and try to set the record straight on a man whose contributions to the field had largely been mythologized across a lot of media surrounding AI for games, including my own. I had pieced together his career outside of the games industry, which is a polite way of saying I stalked his LinkedIn profile, but I wanted to hear the story of how it all connected. And in truth, he's been on a path of discovery ever since completing his work on F.E.A.R that has now led him back into the industry and the formation of Bitpart. So of course, the big question on my mind was why leave? The vibe within the studio suggested that Monolith knew they were onto a hit, and the press and sales not long after only reinforced this. So why give it all up to go back to college and enter grad school?
It was a very kind of backwards decision to go back to grad school after, I was kind of at my career high, but I think it was a combination of things. It was, so for one thing, it was just this eye-opening experience working on planning in F.E.A.R and starting to dig into academic literature and realizing that there are people exploring this problem more deeply. And I felt like I was only scratching the surface and didn't I learned AI on the job, but I felt like I didn't really know AI. And of course, it took getting into grad school to realize at that time, no one really knew AI. It was kind of this, people were exploring a lot of things, but there was a lot not figured out. And that's still the case in some degree, but so part of it was the curiosity. Part of it was also in the kind of research I was doing on the job, I was coming across a lot of papers that were inspiring me coming out of the MIT Media Lab from Bruce Bloomberg's group. And that's the group where Damian Isla was doing his master's work. Damian went to undergrad and did his master's at MIT and was in Bruce's group at the Media Lab for a time, and they were working on really advanced for the time simulations of dogs, like dogs that you could train and packs of dogs. And there were a lot of ideas in GOAP. GOAP really combined, on the one hand, it's a simplified version of strips planning, but then there's the whole agent architecture that supports that, that's inspired by the C4 architecture developed in Bruce Bloomberg's research group. So reading that stuff just made me really want to, go and join that group and be part of the evolution of what they were doing. I'd been working on F.E.A.R for a while and had been like presenting at conferences about what we were doing. And I reached out to Bruce and said, hey, I'm interested in applying to your group. And he wrote back, and it was this bittersweet email. He was like, oh yeah, I've seen your presentations and love what you're doing. I'd love to have you in my group, but I'm leaving.
While Bloomberg was moving back into the industry, he introduced Jeff to a number of his colleagues who might be interested in having him come on board. This led to him meeting Deb Roy. Roy was at the time an associate professor at MIT who had previously defended his PhD thesis at the institution in 1999. Roy's research in the early 2000s had been heavily focused on natural language, with the likes of speech recognition and critically building interfaces that would allow for systems to build meaning and understanding of human language. And it was this interaction with Roy that led to what at first may seem like a deviation from Jeff's previous work, but as we'll see later, will prove to have a huge influence on his eventual return to game development.
Deb had just had his first child, and his research vision was pivoting to trying to understand how children learn language, trying to understand how that could inform how we could get machines to converse. Like any new parent, he installed 11 cameras and 14 microphones in his ceiling and recorded everything his son did for 3 years. And so he had a complete record of everything that happened in his home with the 3 and later 4 people who lived there. And from that, the research group was doing really interesting research in tracking language development. And there's a great TED talk about this that Deb gave. And it was really hard work. But, I went to grad school in 2005, and this was like kind of too early for the cloud. And it was just like doing that massive amount of audio and video required the grad students to cart around physical laptops going back and forth to Deb's house. And Deb's house almost caught on fire at one point due to all this equipment in his. But anyway, so the research group was trying to understand, like, if you had a lot of data about how a small group of people converse every day, could you learn how language develops and what words mean? But I was coming in with this game development experience, and Deb just kind of let me have kind of free reign on a parallel track that was exploring kind of the same problem, but kind of flipping the problem around. So I ended up creating video games that would record human players conversing and interacting in first-person 3D. And I would log every action they took and every word they said to each other by typing text, or we could do speech to text.
But in order to build a game around conversations, and also critically have it that one person can build a huge chunk of this experience on their own, it needed to have some sort of constraints put upon it. The resulting project was the restaurant game, a small playable experience built inside the Torque game engine that allowed players to assume the roles of customers or waiters, and by doing so helped build a framework around which players could initiate conversation.
There were about 40 interactive objects, like vases on the table and plates of food and chairs and a microwave and a cash register. And every object had the same 5 or 6 choices of interaction. Any object you clicked on, you could pick it up, you could sit on it, you could take a bite of it, you could hand it to someone. And we just wanted to see, what do players do in this environment, and how can we learn how to understand language by the context in which that language is used.
Sir, do not sit on the table.
The restaurant game takes the ideas that Roy had been exploring but explodes it in scale. Rather than looking at a handful of people and how they handled speech, Orkin's project led to thousands of individual players participating in the game over a period of time. But also, it allowed for ease of accumulating data. Given a lot less had to be transcribed manually, you could access the history of actions a player had tried to execute within the game, where they stood relative to one another, or messages that they typed to each other within the space. But in 2007, the restaurant game didn't really look or feel like a traditional game. And so one of Orkin's biggest concerns in the beginning was whether getting people to roleplay in a small online environment would actually yield results.
We weren't confident that anyone would play the game because there wasn't really a game. It was just like, all right, you're a customer, you're a waitress, come have dinner. And you were anonymously paired online. I was running all these game servers. Again, this was pre-cloud, so I had a closet in the media lab with like 7 old PCs that had been abandoned, and each one was running multiple game servers. And I host, I don't know how many people at once. But it was also pre-social media, so I didn't have really a way to get the news out that there was this game that I wanted people to play. I was just like emailing game developers I knew, researchers, trying to get featured on like Hacker News, or back then like Dig was a news aggregation site.
And all of that grinding paid off, with over 16,000 people playing the game in the end. But what is the end result of getting all of this data? Would it even make sense? Even within the trappings of a game environment, it's easy for players to go off-piste. There was nothing constraining players from deviating from the transaction of a customer and waiter in a restaurant. They were simply told their roles and then left to get on with it. So what did the end result look like?
People went through the motions of what happens in a restaurant, role-playing. Hello, sir, welcome to our restaurant. Have a seat right here. And then they would take an order and serve food. There was a menu. You could get the chef to serve specific items through keywords. And there was a bartender. And people would order their food. They would eat it and pay their bill. But the other half of the players did anything you could think of. They would, flirt with the waitress. People would pick up the cash register and run out the door, robbing the restaurant.
Those experiences can be experienced even bodily by the person who, for all intents and purposes, is sitting at a computer typing.
I played a game called The Restaurant that's put out by MIT, where you get to be a waiter or a waitress in the restaurant.
Uh-huh.
And a customer came in and sat down, and as I started to take his order, he got up and walked off with the cash register.
Yep.
And I really felt insulted.
That's right.
I ran out in the street after him and got it back.
Right, because we project ourselves into these creations of ours. And
There was a guy who sent me a screenshot of how he had stacked like 17 cherry cheesecakes and climbed on the roof of the restaurant and was celebrating with champagne. People would joke about like, can you tell me where the bathroom is? Because I hadn't built a bathroom into my little virtual restaurant. So there was a lot of fun ad-libbing of like, oh, sorry, it's broken. You got to go outside and pee in the back or whatever.
So the real trick next is to reverse engineer from all of these interactions into meaningful results. What could be done with all of that data? Well, by letting thousands of players participate in this environment, Orkin had effectively crowdsourced information on what is the range of possible interactions and narratives that could occur within the restaurant. Sure, it's not 100% complete, but it provides sufficient scaffolding for what would ultimately become the major contributions of his thesis, in that he could then build an AI system that acted as a narrative director, guiding the story by recognizing what the player was trying to do and having AI control the other player to support a narrative where possible.
So by the time I really had a good data set, it was 2009. And initially, it's kind of interesting. Initially, I was experimenting with language models. But at that time, they were just LMs, not LLMs. There were no large language models. If you wanted a language model, you would just train it yourself. There weren't like big pre-trained models. So I was taking the data from like 10,000 gameplays of the restaurant game and training a language model that included actions as well, and just creating characters that could randomly interact with each other. And it was very entertaining, but they would get caught in cycles and there was a lot of incoherent interactions, and it was kind of a neat toy problem, but not workable for an actual game. So I started to realize I needed more semantics in the data I'd collected, and it wasn't going to be something that machine learning could just magically produce, it had to I needed to somehow get some human input to explain that data. And that kind of inspired the pivot in my research in 2010, where I started developing tools that would let me hire anyone on the internet who was fluent in English to review these transcripts of gameplay in the restaurant and explain what I called events. So you would it was like you were looking at a timeline view of everything that happened in the game, and you would place these spans of color representing events and give them a label. So it's like, from here to here, someone's ordering food. From here to here, somebody's serving food. From here to here, someone's arguing about getting the wrong order. From here to here, somebody's eating the food. And we would overlay these annotations onto thousands of transcripts. And then there was another step of clustering dialogue. In the data I collected, I found that there could be hundreds of ways to say the same thing. Asking for the check, we found 136 different ways people word that. And so we ended up with, I can't remember, maybe 85 different clusters of dialogue that we referred to as speech acts. And between the speech acts and the annotation of the events, we had enough information where now we could run a planning system a little bit different than GOP, maybe more similar to an HTN, but not quite. But it was a system that would pick an event and start automating characters, but then also watch for what the player was doing, always try to match content we've seen in the past with some abstraction of the history of what's happened up to that moment. And by the time I finished the PhD, I totally finished by the beginning of 2013. I defended in December of 2012 and then got the thesis signed off in 2013. And by that point, I could automate a waitress who would converse with you and walk around and serve you food and react appropriately if you did something weird, like sitting on top of the table or stealing the cash register or whatever. And that kind of planted the seeds for what I've been working on kind of in the decade since.
So with the PhD complete, what next? Could this be a viable tool to start using in game development? I think, despite how interesting the technology was, it would have been a tough sell around 10 years ago, and this led to Jeff's decade outside of games, as he recognized the value and potential of the technology he had developed in other business areas.
My goal with the PhD was never to become a professor. It was to explore new AI technologies, and then I hope to do something entrepreneurial after. So the way I pursued that was that after my PhD, I got grants from the government, from the National Science Foundation, to commercialize my PhD research. And initially, the grant we got was to turn the restaurant game technology into an educational game that would let kids in middle school practice social skills, learn empathy through interacting socially with AI characters. And we started down that road, rewriting the AI system from the restaurant game to be able to run on the cloud and integrate with Unity. And we made a bit of progress, but it wasn't a ton of funding. And so progress was slow. And then what happened was the Amazon Alexa came out, and all of a sudden, everybody cared about conversational AI. In 2013, when I started Giant Otter, nobody cared about conversational AI. It wasn't clear that there was any business opportunity there. So we were like, where could you apply this? Educational games, maybe, practicing communication skills. And the thought was that could be the thing that would fund the core technology, and then eventually we'd bring it back to mainstream games. I was very naive. I'd never started a company before and didn't really know what I was doing.
Morning, this is Tamara.
Hi, it's Jeff from BAM.
Can you refresh my memory on the reason for our call today?
Yeah, I wanted to know if you wanted to purchase some BAM.
Look, to be blunt, I did a little investigating, and I just can't justify the cost of your product right now. We don't have a large budget to try new materials like this, and your product is significantly more expensive than your competitors.
So all of a sudden, chatbots were becoming a big business. The earlier hype cycle of chatbots, this was around like 2015. And so given how slow we were making progress on turning our solution into something for games, and the fact that it was very unclear how this was going to work as a business before we ran out of money, we just decided to pivot and go all in on the conversational engine that was unique to us, that we could learn conversation from data and power a conversation via voice or text. And we just doubled down on that and discarded the work we were doing in Unity. And that sent us into the direction of becoming a chatbot for businesses that got us acquired by Drift, which is a marketing tech company. And we became Drift's AI team and built the product that led to powering automated chat on big websites like Adobe and Peloton and Bloomberg and companies like that. And so, my thinking at Giant Otter at that time was like, oh, well, we've got to go where there's an opportunity, and this will, let us become, bring in revenue, maybe become profitable. And that will give us the opportunity to go back and experiment with these game things that are more risky. But business-wise, that makes no sense. Like, you can't go in the direction of becoming an enterprise chatbot and then be like, oh, and we're going to have a new product for games. It's unlikely that that's ever going to work. And sure enough, like, once we went that direction, there was no coming back.
Now, hey, no judgment here. I mean, I was literally a guy in finance for a short period in what now feels like a previous life. Cutting your teeth building a business and learning to deploy AI at scale in the cloud, as was needed at Drift, were all useful skills that would later have an impact on Orkin's future work. And so now in 2024, Bitpart is a startup that revisits many of the ideas from across Jeff's work, but at a time where perhaps the technology has now caught up with him and his ideas. One of the underlying motivations behind the restaurant game was that in F.E.A.R. there are many AI systems working to achieve one overall net effect. In games, even today, you have a navigation mesh that is being used to dictate how and where a character can move across the space. You have a decision-making layer, in this case goal-oriented action planning, to select the actions the soldiers will execute. And then finally, the bark and dialogue layer was there to help sell the effect, even if it was all smoke and mirrors and entirely fabricated. What if you could build a system that handles all of it at once? Spatial awareness and movement, action selection, and conversational dialogue, all as one system. As Jeff explained to me in our interview, it was one of the first things he tried when at MIT, but quickly the range of actions, preconditions, and effects was simply too large for a planner to encapsulate. Encoding this information manually and then searching through it would simply be impossible. The restaurant game took this one step farther, in that by crowdsourcing thousands of playthroughs, a knowledge base could be reverse engineered, rather than crafted manually. But as discussed already, this too was massively time consuming. Annotating all the playthroughs was an intense workload.
The whole thinking behind the restaurant game was, what could we get characters to do if we didn't need to by hand come up with all of the behavior and language, but instead just get a snapshot of ideas of what could happen in this restaurant environment? Well, an LLM is a snapshot of all the world's language. And so after 4 years at Drift and playing with LLMs, I was starting to recognize that LLMs were an alternative to what I was doing with the restaurant game. It was a new way to create many examples of the dialogue or behavior that could happen in different narrative situations. So started, after 4 years at Drift, the AI team was in a good place, and I felt like it was probably a good time to move on, and started talking to my teammate, Sarah Rudsky, who is my co-founder of Bitpart. So interesting backstory there. Sarah is a theater person. She studied theater in undergrad at Dartmouth and then became a theater writer, director, producer in Chicago with the Chicago Shakespeare Theater Company. And she started working with me on the restaurant game. For the restaurant game, I had to hire a lot of part-time help, like remote help through websites like Upwork, to annotate data or play the game repeatedly or cluster lines of dialogue that seem to mean the same thing. Just out of luck, I found Sarah, who was looking for side jobs while working in theater where you don't make much money. And she got involved in data annotation, and it was clear right away that she was kind of overqualified for what I was having her do. So then she started managing all the annotators I was hiring around the world and started, collaborating with me on like what could make the system better, how can we create better characters. So when I started Giant Otter, I hired her in as our first non-engineer, and she was like a project manager. And then she and I led the Drift AI team together. And then after we'd spent some time at Drift, we started talking about what do we really want to do that brings together my interest in games and AI and her interest in theater. And there was just a pretty clear path to BitPart, leveraging what's happening now with LLMs, as well as revisiting the same techniques I was using for the restaurant game, and bringing in ideas from planners, in particular HTN planners, and bringing that all together. So there are 4 of us that went from Giant Otter to Drift to BitPart, and then with some VC funding, we've now built the team up to 9 people, I think soon 10. And yeah, it's really fun. We're experimenting with kind of the new way to create characters in games, especially focused on multi-agent interactions, populating a space where a group of characters perform their roles together. What we're going for is a seamless mix of dialogue and action. There's some kind of maybe unfortunate things that happened to us with BitPart. Like 2022, the economy was booming until it wasn't. I thought this is going to be easy. I'm going to leave Drift. There are plenty of investors interested because we've had a successful exit previously, and we're just going to raise a whole bunch of money and build this great thing. I left Drift. The economy collapsed. All of the interest in the metaverse stuff kind of melted, which also kind of hurt our spin on things. And then the other thing that happened was that ChatGPT was released to the world maybe a month after we started BitPart. Maybe in some ways stole our thunder a little bit. It really changed people's understanding of what AI is, or people's definition of what AI is. And there are a number of startups that then rushed to market to say, basically, ChatGPT is a character. And if you just stick that in the body of an avatar, voila, you have next generation NPCs. And that's not quite the perspective that I don't agree with that perspective. And BitPart, we're doing something quite different.
What you see on screen now is the demo build of BitPart's AI tool that was showcased behind closed doors at GDC earlier this year. All of the non-player characters in the saloon are powered by a system that was derived from a large corpus of knowledge fed into a large language model. But in order for it to work in a game, it's then reduced down into a planning model that can run seamlessly in the engine. Naturally, this is far from the final product. It's still in development, and no doubt things have evolved quite a bit since I got to see this demo. But fingers crossed, we will have a follow-up on how this technology is evolving in a future video. Time is a funny thing. We might have an idea that we feel could change the world, but it could easily seem impossible on first passing, or indeed on the second or third attempt as well. It's a journey that anyone who's tried to build a business, build a community, or go through the perils of grad school will no doubt have encountered. But as you continue to gather knowledge, experience, and, dare I say it, a little bit of wisdom, sometimes you find yourself staring once again at that initial idea. While I most certainly enjoyed the hours spent listening to Jeff's stories that we've recounted both in this video and the F.E.A.R retrospective, the one thing that I've really taken away from this is how the passage of time can often afford us perspective. I recall studying F.E.A.R in grad school and seeking to find my own way to address some of these issues. It went in a different direction, and one that I'm rather confident in saying was a dead end. But it was exciting to hear how Jeff and I share similar perspectives on many aspects of AI for game development. So I can't help but admire his persistence as he returns to this idea once again, taking everything he's learned over the past 20 years all in an effort to give it another shot. Thanks for watching this episode of AI in Games, and a special thanks once again to Dr. Jeff Orkin for joining me here on the channel. Interviewing Jeff has been an absolute pleasure, and let me tell you, it's been fantastic to not only collaborate on these videos, but also to say that BitPart is one of the sponsors of our inaugural AI in Games conference, which runs just mere weeks after this video goes live. BitPart were in fact the very first company to sign up to be a sponsor of the conference. To have Jeff be one of the very first people to back this new endeavor was truly something special. Anyway, enough of this self-indulgence. Go and check out what Jeff's up to, go watch some more videos, and I've got more videos to make, projects to run. Let's get on with it. Stay safe, take care, I'll be back.